Hi, everyone. I'm Trish Triumpho Sullivan, and I'm here with local author Carol McKibben, and she's going to talk to us for a few minutes about her book. I'm going to put it in front of her face for a second.
Okay, do that.
There we go. Salinas, a history of race and resilience in an agricultural city. And we have an audience here, and they're going to ask a couple of questions of Carol, and then I have a couple of questions of her too. Okay. So here we are. Go ahead and have a seat.
Well, first of all, I welcome questions. I wrote this book in order to show how it's possible to be inclusive in history and without overcomplicating it, right? So even though the book spans several hundred years, it is meant to bring all of the actors who participated in making Salinas into a mainstream narrative. And I hope I did that without making it overcomplicated, right? I wanted to avoid jargon. I wanted to make this a story that resonated with the people who know the story from their own experience, but perhaps only know it from a very limited range, either from one community story or one personal story. I wanted to bring the threads of Salinas's history together in a meaningful way that was also comprehensible, and that also put Salinas in a bigger context. It's not isolated, right? Salinas is part of California. It's part of the West. It's part of America. So the story of Salinas is America's story. And I hope that I was able to convey that. I'd love to hear feedback, and I'd love to answer any questions that you may have, if I can.
So do we have any questions from the audience here?
I have a question.
Thank you.
First of all, this is a great book, at least from what
I think it would be great if you identified yourself.
My name is Joe Lopez. I was a local resident. I was raised at Salinas up until 1970. I still have family here, but otherwise I'm in and out of the valley. And I traverse the valley taking pictures and writing information for a book that I want to write. But I noticed in your book, you have a lot of footnotes, and I generally don't go through that. But the footnotes support your writings in such a manner that it brings in two things. One, the truth, and then the other side is the emotional side that you managed to penetrate. And I wanted to ask you, how were you able to do that? You're able to bring in the heart of the valley, the diversity. The book is a diverse, talks about diverse. This book is about this book is a diverse book. So how are you able to incorporate both of those?
Well, I think that your question, Joe, and thank you, it's a really good one, is really about the art and work of being an historian and how you manage to make that happen. And what you do is take the time and energy and hard work of research into a variety of sources. So I think it's really important to hear from people, and I did a lot of interviewing, and I tried my best to interview people from a range of experiences without suggesting that any one person speaks for their entire identifiable group, right? But also to look at things like census data and look at maps and look at other scholars' work. And I'm glad that you were able to note the footnotes, because the footnotes are of critical import, not just to show you why what is written, but also in terms of context. How does this fit into the larger historical scholarship that's out there? And also in terms of a jumping off point for others. So if you're reading along and you find a footnote about the farm worker movement, which we were just discussing, you can use that, you can go track that down, and it might inspire your own work or another whole book that you might be interested in doing. So those footnotes are meant both to give people a chance to look further into a specific issue or topic that they're interested in, and also to document why the argument is the way it is, and to show the context. So a lot of my footnotes include a reference to other historical scholarship, and in the book itself, I really meant to showcase Salinas as part of California history, as part of American history. And it's not an easy thing to do, so it's not something that can be done in a month, right? But it is worth doing it that way, and that's the right way of doing it, and that's the scholar's craft. That's our craft. That's how we work. That's why it's hard. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. Other questions? Any questions from whoever is listening in? Okay, there is a hand up. Trish?
So I have a question.
All right, but Trish, there's a hand up here that I think somebody's asking a question, and this is not my computer. So,
Here.
Oh, okay.
That's all.
All right, so what is your...
So my question, well, not only a question, kind of a statement that I'd like you to just kind of talk about, because I think that that in general, our local history is all about the people who won, in other words, who came and colonized. But our city was built by people of color who are not really acknowledged often as the builders of our city, and you explore that in your book.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that just a little
Sure.
bit? Because I think
and
that's...
if in the best of all possible worlds, this book would have been a lot longer because
Sequel.
I would have, an historian that I admire enormously, Johnny McFarriger, just wrote a book on California, which I hope you carry, because he spends, out of a 400-page book, the first almost 200 pages on the period of indigeneity, the period before California was a state, right? That's an important period. I didn't have the same capacity for this book, but I think it's important to acknowledge that for most of its history, this place was not an American city. I wrote about an American city, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're quite right that historians tended to be people who represented themselves in their own narratives. So the pushback to that came beginning in the 80s and 90s, when individuals who didn't see themselves in history said we were actors too. And so the focus of this book is to, first of all, be a proponent of the fact that we're all historical actors. We all played a role from when this was invented, this place as an American city, to today. We all have a role to play, and it's an important one. And so it's hard to do that. And I regret that I didn't do it completely. There are groups that are not in this story. I was not able, for example, to do justice to the Jewish community in Salinas, which is formidable, important, and had many, important representatives in politics. I did not do justice to indigenous people, mentioned but not really covered as much as I want.
Well, you can't really explore that in context of this.
Well, I could have.
Well,
but they wouldn't have let me do that. So I had to
the powers that be.
Right. Yeah. Well, yes. But I also felt like I wish I had been able to go into a little bit more depth about the African-American experience here, which was also important. But you have to kind of pick and choose a little bit, because what you don't want is a vegetable stew. What you don't want is a narrative that tries to be so inclusive that it loses the thread of argument. So what I noted about Salinas was that there were groups here that played central roles in the development of the city. And this is first and foremost an urban history. And those groups included multiple groups of Asians, Mexican Americans, not just Hispanic people generally, but this was a place that was settled primarily with Spanish-speaking people who originated in various parts of Mexico. So I narrowed the scope. The white people, so-called, that I included tended to come from the American Southwest. There was a big contingent that came in the 30s as a result of the Depression and the environmental catastrophe of the Dust Bowl. So that was significant. And so I tried to tie these major groups together. And going back to the question of narrative and footnotes, I tried to interview as many people as I could to add color and life to the story. Oral history is important not because it's true. It's important because of the perspectives that you learn from interviews with people. So you get a little window into lives lived and examples of experiences, but they have to be treated carefully, just like every document is biased. Everything is. So you have to take everything with a grain of salt and try to put it together. But to answer your question, Trish, it was very important to me that this was a story that was authentic and as true as possible. And that meant that it was not going to be a story where so-called white people are at the center of the narrative to the exclusion of everyone else, or men were at the center of the narrative to the exclusion of everyone else, women, right? But everybody. And so, I wish I had been able to do more of that. I did the best I could in the time I had.
Well, I think you may need a sequel for this. One of the things that I've noticed about Salinas is Salinas, since I've lived here, has always been a divided city. In other words, there's been we quote the other side of the tracks, where historically people of color and disenfranchised populations have lived. So it was made worse by the freeway coming through and dividing the city. The railroad did before. But now the freeway has kind of divided it. But one of the things that I noticed here is we have this area called Chinatown.
Right.
But my understanding of history, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that all people of color were living in that.
But be careful
area.
with that.
I'm just curious.
But I'm going to pause here. Thanks. because it is about race and ethnicity, but it's also about class. So when you talk about dividing lines and other side of the tracks, let's not forget that socioeconomic class plays a critical role and has. And that's why I spent some time in Alisal talking about this migrant population from the Dust Bowl. Because that separated people off too. So they intersect. It's all connected, right? But it's not one or the other. Race and class really do matter. Gender matters as well, right? So you want to represent everyone as much as possible, but you also want to create a narrative that's readable, that's jargon-free, that makes sense to people. And I would not write a sequel. Instead, I would want people to see this as a jumping off place and write their own sequels.
Oh, I love that.
I would hope that this inspires people who are interested in doing the research and doing the work and writing their own view, because this is by no means the definitive history of Salinas. Nothing is. So it should inspire more writing.
Well, I'm inspired by your writing. You're a very good storyteller.
So you write the sequel, Trish.
No, seriously, you're a very good storyteller, and your book reads very well, which is difficult for a history book.
There were two elements in society here in Salinas that had probably the bigger impact on me. Law enforcement. At the age of 3, I was placed in a holding cell in the city jail with my mother, because she had been victimized by somebody else, and the officer that showed up, shouldn't even call him an officer, but the guy that showed up in uniform arrested my mom and her friend. This was over at the, I forgot the name of the restaurant on Main Street, where IHOP, it was like an IHOP. And I was just sitting there. This woman comes off the side, attacks my mom. I'm 3 years old in the backseat of a convertible, and it freaked me out.
Of
The
course
police
it did.
came, arrested my
Of course
mom,
it did. It's a trauma,
and they're
right?
going to leave me in the car, but not for the citizens
Right.
speaking out and saying, "Hey, you can't leave that little boy in the car." That cop would have left me there. So I got to go with my mom to the city jail in the old city hall, and I remember playing on the floor with the little wet wood train that I had. And eventually we were released. On my 18th birthday, I got booked into the city jail. I spent the weekend there for something that I didn't do. And they wound up dropping the charges, but I had my own experiences
Well, it's
there.
a trauma, and it's a trauma that many people, many teenagers, young adults, people of color experience as a normal part of life. It's been normalized. It inspired some pushback, because famous pushback in Black Lives Matter. But before Black Lives Matter, there were some officer-involved shootings in Salinas in the mid-2000s that really sparked a change in law enforcement. And that really, that preceded the nationwide movement. It's troubling, it's serious, and it's something that was swept under the carpet for a long, long time, but it's now out there. And among the things that were revealed, and this was, I'm thinking of the Watts riots too. I mean, that was all inspired by police departments acting in a military fashion and targeting communities of color, whole communities, not just individuals, which is bad enough. And it inspired a change in recent years. But in Salinas, that change happened a little earlier. Number one, the police departments began to look a lot more like the communities they were supposed to serve. And more people of color were hired, women were hired. Adele Frazee, of course, famously was the chief of police, and that's not uncommon anymore. We were just talking about Tina Nieto, who was hired. She worked in law enforcement in LA. She was hired to be chief of police in Marina. Now she's the sheriff. Who would have thought that could happen in the 1980s around here? The other big thing that happened is in the wake of the Vietnam War, a lot of the leftover material that came from fighting a war, assault weapons and military garb and tanks and that sort of thing, was just dumped on police departments. And it was supposedly an effort to fight crime or the war on drugs, but it was not used in wealthy white neighborhoods that were just as filled with crime and drugs, right? It was just not targeted like that. So I think as a nation, we've become more aware of this discrepancy. Much needs to be done about that. And yet I'm hopeful that much is changing. Much is changing.
The saving grace for a lot of kids in this town was the educational system.
Right.
In spite of everything else that was going on, we had an opportunity to get into the elementary, junior high, and high schools. If we wanted to go to Hartnell, it was there. Otherwise, for me, there were opportunities outside of the area, which I took advantage of. But I remember my teachers more than I remember the bad cops, but I remember the bad cops.
Well, Joe, you make an important point, because when in the aftermath of these officer-involved shootings in the 2014 1 year actually in Salinas, the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey partnered with the city of Salinas to do a big study about why there are gangs. What is this all? Why is this happening, and what can we do? And interestingly, the conclusion was not that people were in high density housing. That was a good thing. That kept kids under the eyes of their elders. The problem was in the school system. The school system needed to be a lot more available to kids, including the extracurriculars that in wealthier, whiter communities, people just take for granted. The school day needed to be longer. We needed to be able to give children more sense of their own possibilities. And there were a number of lawsuits also, the Diana lawsuit comes to mind, that challenged targeting children of color into vocational education, right? And encouraging them to be doctors and lawyers and professionals too. So I think that you're absolutely right that the school system in Salinas responded to that crisis in a very helpful, positive way. It's not perfect. There were lots of problems in the 90s here, but it's trying, right? And that's the effort needs to be acknowledged too.
In conclusion, what I'm saying and the things that I've said, both about law enforcement and the educational institutions. When I left here, I went into law enforcement in San Jose, and I retired after 35 years at the rank of sergeant. But the things I learned there, looking back, I do here. There's a lot to tell. There's a lot missing, but there's a lot of good stories. There's a lot of good people.
And I hope you will tell them.
If I can get beyond my mental block, I want to thank you very much.
You're welcome very much.
I am going to finish this book maybe in the next couple of months. Otherwise, I've got a lot of to-dos.
Yeah.
And thank you for hosting this.
No,
I came down from San Jose for this.
Well, thank you for coming down. And I just wanted to say one thing as we're talking about this, about this topic is, anyone who is an Anglo or, appears as Anglo, who doesn't believe that racial profiling takes place, try driving a 1964 Chevy Bel Air and see how many times you get pulled over.
Thank you.
Because I've been pulled over so many times by police thinking that I was probably a person of color. And when they came up and saw me, they were surprised. It was visible surprise. You could tell they were hoping that they were going to harass someone. And when they saw that I wasn't a person of color, they would say, "Oh, your tail lights out." Seriously.
Oh, when you get
So
old,
thank
they
you.
leave you alone. So I drive down the street now. Nobody wants to pull me over anymore. So
Good afternoon.
thank you very much.
You're
I will
welcome
finish
very
this.
much.
Good afternoon.
And I will conclude if there are no more questions. Any questions? No comments?
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you for
Yeah,
having me.
Can you hang on for 1 sec, please? I'll be right back.
Thank you for having me, Trish. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things. I think they're really important, and I hope they inspire others to write.
So thank you for joining me today, and everyone that showed up today for our kind of brown bag lunch special here, and talking to the people who joined us online. So thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
Of course.
Have a wonderful holiday season.
I will. You as well. Thank you.
And we're going to sign off here and thank everyone for joining us online. This will be available as a recording, so you can find it on YouTube, on the Downtown Book and Sound YouTube channel, and on our Facebook page for later viewing. So thank you very much. Also, we do have bookmarks and book plates available for free. If you miss Carol's talk today and you want to buy a book and have it signed, we have signed book plates for you. We're happy to mail them anywhere in the U.S. Well, actually in the world. Happy to do that too. Have a good day and happy holidays, everyone.
Yeah, that's first for me. But do you have my